All right, this is your first flowing practice video. In going through this, make certain to listen closely to all the tags and dates that are provided in this 1AC that I am preparing to read. If need be, during this video, you can pause, you can rewind in order to go back and record things the way that they should be. But by the end of this exercise and by the end of me reading through everything, you should have all of the tags that I listed as well as all the dates that I said listed. Bring them into class. We'll be going over them and make certain that they were done properly. So without further ado, make certain that you're paying attention and listening closely. Contention 1 is justification. Subpoint A. Relations between regional actors are deteriorating. This is by Harrison in 16. The latest escalation in tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia has set off alarm bells across the globe. There is a real fear that failure to repair the rupture in this relationship could lead to a worsening of the already dire humanitarian crisis in Syria, further destabilize a perilously volatile region, and even impede the battle against ISIS. When Iraq, one of the region's most vulnerable and least stable countries, offers to mediate between the far more powerful Iran and Saudi Arabia, you know it's grim. Subpoint B. The war is increasingly becoming a humanitarian disaster. This is by Abramson in 17. The war has also fueled a humanitarian disaster. After 2 years of fighting, the United Nations launched an appeal early this year on behalf of 18.8 million people who it found needed assistance in Yemen, more than two-thirds of the country's population. At that time, it warned of a possible famine with 3.3 million people being acutely malnourished. Subpoint C. Building alliances with Saudi Arabia is a fool's errand because they will ultimately betray us. This is by Zachariah in 18. Watching the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's approach, a mix of both authoritarianism and real reform, Khashoggi became more critical but was never a radical. So why was he apparently seen as so threatening? Perhaps because he was respected within the Saudi establishment. Harvard's Tariq Masood suggests that the Khashoggi affair might signal that there is greater dissent within the Saudi establishment than we had believed. If so, this is significant. When the scholar Samuel Huntington studied the breakdown of authoritarian regimes in the 1970s and 80s, he noted that a schism within the ruling elite was almost always the precursor to a broader breakdown of the regime. Thus, my partner and I offering the following plan. Plan. The United States federal government should substantially reduce direct commercial sales and or foreign military sales to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Specifically, the United States will terminate arms sales to Saudi Arabia so long as it continues to pursue offensive actions in its war in Yemen. Contention 2 is solvency. Subpoint A. If they were a pariah state, their freedom of action would be constrained. This is by Brando in 17. Instead of being treated as an ally, Saudi Arabia should be a pariah, argued Freedom House President Mark Lagoon. At the very least, U.S. officials should drop the faux intimacy and treat Riyadh as Washington once treated Moscow. An important power to be engaged, not supported, endorsed, praised, subsidized, and reassured. Ultimately, regime change in Riyadh is as necessary, indeed perhaps even more so, than regime change in Tehran. Subpoint B. The U.S. has a lot of leverage in the area. If the U.S. withdrew support, Saudi Arabia would be compelled to change its approach. This is by French in 18. The Saudi military is highly dependent on advanced American weaponry. American F-15s comprise close to half the Saudi fighter force, and the Saudi variant of the F-15E Strike Eagle represents a substantial portion of the Air Force's striking power. On land, the Saudi army is dependent almost exclusively on American M1 Abrams tanks and Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. They can't just waltz over to a different country and transform their armed forces, not without suffering enormous setbacks in readiness and effectiveness during a years-long transition. A fundamental reality of arms deals is that a major arms purchase essentially locks the purchasing nation in a dependent posture for training, spare parts, and technical upgrades. Contention 3 is our first advantage, which is Saudi aggression. Subpoint A. Saudi Arabia is pursuing an aggressive proxy strategy now. This is by De Petris in 17. Yemen, like Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Bahrain, now increasingly reassemble another front in a Saudi-Iran regional Cold War, where a boon for Tehran is seen as a significant geostrategic setback for Riyadh and vice versa. Exceedingly alarmed, the Iranians were using the Houthis as a puppet force. The Saudis assessed that allowing the Houthi militia to swallow up the entire country was a scenario that had to be avoided. The Saudi-led bombing campaign commenced on March 2015 and has continued to this day. Thousands of innocent civilians have been killed and injured, and the country's already weak public health infrastructure has been utterly wiped out. Subpoint B. This is making it more difficult to combat ISIS. This is by Harrison in 16. However, regional states alone cannot prevent the catastrophic effects that would come from continued hostility between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Global powers need to mount a diplomatic offense to prevent this pivotal relationship from falling further into the abyss, to rescue the fledgling peace process on Syria and keep ISIS from benefiting from the recent flare-up in tensions. Subpoint C. It also hurts stability in Syria. This is by Harrison in 16. Increased hostility between Iran and Saudi Arabia will further the nightmare in Syria, the epicenter of the current regional instability. Iran will likely redouble its efforts to fortify the Assad regime, and the Saudis will ramp up support for rebel groups in an attempt by each side to gain the upper hand. Moreover, if a rupture in Iran-Saudi relations leads to a collapse of the diplomatic track, military action on the ground in Syria once again becomes unhinged from the political process. Efforts by Jordan to vet rebel groups and create a moderate front with which to negotiate with the Assad regime will likely end abruptly, potentially fracturing rebel groups. Fighting thus will take on a new intensity, with more Syrian towns experiencing the same horrific fate of starvation as Madaya. Subpoint D. Arms sales are the key factor making crisis resolution difficult. This is by Thrall in 18. American arms sales can also prolong and intensify interstate conflicts. Although the goal might be to alter the military balance of a conflict to facilitate a speedy end, sending weapons can also encourage the recipients to continue fighting even with no chance of success, leading to more casualties. Contention 4 is our second advantage, which would be human rights. Subpoint A. U.S. arms sales highlight that the U.S. cares more about counterterror than human rights, greenlighting abuses. This is by Thrall in 18. Finally, U.S. weapons sales in the name of battling terrorism and insurgency undermine U.S. national security when they are made to corrupt regimes and to nations with a history of human rights violations. American firepower can enhance regime security and enable oppressive governments to mistreat minority groups and wage inhumane actions against insurgents or terrorist groups. Currently, Saudi Arabia is waging war in Yemen using primarily American weapons, which the United States has continued to provide, even though the Saudis have been cited repeatedly for human rights violations and targeting civilian populations. Subpoint B. The result is the preventable mass killing and starvation of civilians, generally, and children in particular. This is by Nowak in 18. More than 85,000 children may have died of hunger since Saudi Arabia intervened in the war in Yemen 3 years ago, according to Save the Children, an international non-government organization. For every child killed by bombs and bullets, dozens are starving to death, and it's entirely preventable, said Tamer Kirolos, Save the Children's country director in Yemen. Subpoint C. The U.S. is in a unique position to shape Saudi behavior. This is by Seligman in 18. The United States has more leverage than it claims, he added. Everything we know about the U.S. stance is that it does make a difference because the actors in the drama do look to the U.S. for actions or restraints. The great danger is the Yemeni conflict becomes a terrible stain on the U.S. reputation. Subpoint D. This makes cutting off arms a moral imperative. This is by Muhammad in 16. It's too late for the children of Salah Basrallah, but there's no excuse not to do the right thing now. States should act immediately to ensure that none of Yemen's warring parties is supplied, either directly or indirectly, with weapons, munitions, military equipment, or technology that would be used in any furtherance of the conflict. And they must do everything in their power to ensure that there is an independent international investigation into violations by all sides aimed at ensuring justice and reparation for Salah Basrallah and the thousands of other victims of this deadly war. And with that, I am open to cross-examination and further points of clarification.